I never thought the sound of my own name could terrify me until I heard it whispered through my bedroom window at 3 in the morning. It had been 7 years since I left the congregation of the Eternal Witness, a group so obscure that even typing their name into a search engine yields nothing but dead links and scrubbed forum posts. Most people have never heard of them, and that's exactly how they want it. They don't recruit through advertisements or public gatherings. They find you when you're vulnerable, when you're searching for meaning in the wreckage of your life, and they make you believe that you've finally found home. I was 19 when they found me, grieving my mother's death and floundering through my first year of college. I was 26 when I finally escaped. Now I'm 33, and they've never stopped looking for me. The congregation operated out of a compound in rural Oregon, hidden among dense forests and accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through miles of wilderness. To the outside world, we were a self-sufficient community focused on sustainable living and spiritual growth. To those of us inside, it was a prison with invisible bars. We had no internet access, no phones, no contact with the outside world, unless it was carefully monitored and approved. Our leader, who we called Father Matthias, taught us that the world beyond our gates was corrupted beyond redemption, that we were the chosen few who would survive the coming collapse. He had a way of speaking that made you believe every word, a charisma that could make the most outrageous claims sound like absolute truth. He told us that our families had been infected by the poison of modern society, that they would try to pull us back into darkness if we maintained contact with them. Every day began before dawn with 3 hours of prayer and meditation in the main hall, a cavernous building with no windows and a single door that was locked from the outside. Father Matthias would lead us in chants that he claimed were ancient words of power, syllables that made no sense, but that we repeated until our voices were hoarse and our minds were blank. After prayers came breakfast, a meager portion of oatmeal or rice that left us perpetually hungry. Then we scattered to our assigned duties, working in the gardens, maintaining the buildings, or participating in what they called consciousness expansion sessions. These sessions involved hours of isolation in small, dark rooms, while recordings of Father Matthias's voice played on loops, reinforcing his teachings and breaking down any remaining independent thought. I was assigned to the archival room, a position that Father Matthias said I had earned through my devotion and spiritual clarity. In reality, I think he sensed that I was beginning to have doubts and wanted to keep me close, where he could monitor me. The archival room was where the congregation kept records of every member, past and present. There were journals, photographs, recordings of private confessions, and detailed notes on each person's psychological vulnerabilities and fears. I spent my days cataloging and organizing these materials, and in doing so, I began to see the pattern. People who questioned Father Matthias disappeared. Sometimes they were said to have ascended to a higher plane of existence. Other times, we were told they had been consumed by their own darkness and had to be removed for the safety of the community. One name appeared repeatedly in the old records with increasingly frantic annotations. Rebecca Townsend. She had been one of the original members, someone Father Matthias had once called his most devoted follower. But according to the notes, Rebecca had begun asking questions about where the community's money was going and why. Father Matthias needed a private residence separate from the rest of us. The last entry about her was dated 15 years ago and simply said, "Subject removed. Threat neutralized. No further surveillance required." I found a photograph of her tucked into one of the journals, a young woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, the kind of smile I hadn't seen on anyone's face in the congregation in years. That photograph haunted me for weeks. I started paying closer attention to things I had trained myself not to notice, the way certain members would suddenly vanish, and how we were forbidden from speaking their names afterward. The locked basement, beneath the main hall where strange sounds sometimes echoed late at night. The fact that Father Matthias seemed to know things about our private thoughts that we had never shared with anyone. I realized that the small rooms where we had our private confessions with him were probably bugged, that he had been building files on each of us, learning our deepest fears and secrets, so he could control us more effectively. The turning point came during a consciousness expansion session when I overheard 2 of the senior members talking outside my isolation room. They thought the soundproofing was better than it actually was. They were discussing a new arrival, a young man who had significant family wealth, and how Father Matthias planned to fully integrate him within 6 months. One of them laughed and said that once they had access to his trust fund, they could finally expand operations to the property they had been eyeing in Montana. They talked about him like he was a resource to be extracted, not a person seeking spiritual guidance. In that moment, everything crystallized with horrible clarity. This wasn't a spiritual community. It was a sophisticated operation designed to exploit vulnerable people for money and power. I knew I had to get out, but I also knew that leaving wouldn't be simple. The compound was monitored by cameras, though we were told they were for our protection against outside threats. The gates were always locked, and the few vehicles on the property were kept under strict control. Members who had tried to leave in the past had been brought back, sometimes by Father Matthias himself, sometimes by devoted followers who went to retrieve them. I had heard whispers about these retrievals, how the people who were brought back were never quite the same afterward, how they would stare at nothing with empty eyes and speak only in the rehearsed phrases from Father Matthias's teachings. I started planning my escape with meticulous care. I began hiding small portions of my already meager meals, building up a supply that I stored in a hollow space I discovered behind a loose board in my sleeping quarters. I stole a knife from the kitchen, wrapping it in cloth and hiding it in the same space. I memorized the patrol schedules of the security members who walked the perimeter at night. I studied the old maps in the archival room, learning the forest trails that led away from the compound and toward the nearest town, which was almost 20 miles away. I knew I would have only one chance, that if I was caught, I would either disappear like Rebecca Townsend, or be broken down and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. The night I chose for my escape was moonless and cloudy, the kind of darkness that feels absolute. I had volunteered for late-night kitchen duty, which gave me a legitimate reason to be awake and moving around the compound after others had gone to their sleeping quarters. I waited until the patrol had passed my building, counting the seconds until I knew they would be at the farthest point of their route. Then I slipped out through a window I had been gradually loosening over the course of weeks, landing in the soft dirt with barely a sound. My heart was hammering so hard I was certain someone would hear it, but the compound remained silent except for the wind moving through the trees. I moved through the shadows between buildings, pausing every few seconds to listen for any sign that I had been detected. The main gate was impossible, so I headed for a section of the perimeter fence that ran close to the forest, where the trees grew thick enough to provide cover. I had noticed during my observation that this area wasn't covered by cameras, probably because the dense vegetation made it difficult to mount them effectively. When I reached the fence, I used the stolen knife to cut through the links, working as quietly as possible. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness, the scrape of metal on metal like thunder in my ears. It took almost 20 minutes to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. By the time I pushed myself into the forest on the other side, I was covered in sweat, despite the cold night air. I didn't allow myself to feel relief. I knew that my absence would be discovered at the morning prayer session, and they would immediately begin searching. I had perhaps 6 hours before they realized I was gone, and maybe another hour before they organized a search party. I needed to put as much distance between myself and the compound as possible before then. The forest at night was a disorienting maze of shadows and sounds. I had a general sense of direction from studying the maps, but I had never actually walked these trails, and in the darkness, every tree looked the same. I pushed forward as quickly as I dared, trying to balance speed with stealth. Branches caught at my clothes and scratched my face. Several times, I stumbled over roots or rocks, hidden in the darkness, barely catching myself before falling. I kept moving, driven by a terror that made my exhaustion irrelevant. As dawn began to break, painting the sky with pale gray light, I heard it for the first time since leaving the compound. My name, called out in the distance behind me. They had discovered my absence earlier than I had hoped. I could hear multiple voices, spread out across the forest, systematically searching. I abandoned any pretense of stealth and ran, crashing through the underbrush with my lungs burning and my legs screaming in protest. The voices seemed to be getting closer. Or maybe that was just my fear amplifying the sound. I ran until I thought my heart would explode, until I was certain I couldn't take another step. Then I ran some more. The forest seemed endless, and I began to wonder if I had somehow gotten turned around, if I was running parallel to the road instead of toward it. Just as despair was beginning to overwhelm me, I burst through a line of trees and found myself on a paved road. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath and almost crying with relief, before I heard an engine approaching. A pickup truck came around the bend, and I stepped into the road, waving my arms frantically. The driver, an older man with weathered features, pulled over with a look of concern. I must have looked like something from a horror movie, covered in scratches and dirt, my clothes torn, and my eyes wild. Before he could ask what was wrong, I begged him to drive, to get away from here as fast as possible. He looked past me toward the forest, perhaps sensing the genuine terror in my voice, and nodded. I climbed into the passenger seat, and as we drove away, I looked back to see figures emerging from the tree line, standing at the edge of the road and watching us disappear. The driver took me to the nearest town and dropped me at a small police station. I tried to explain what had happened, about the congregation and the compound and the people who would be looking for me. The officer who took my statement was polite, but clearly skeptical. He made some calls, but there was no record of any religious community registered at the location I described. The property itself was listed under a series of shell corporations that led nowhere. Without concrete evidence of a crime, there was nothing they could do. They offered to contact family for me, but I had no one. The congregation had been my entire world for 7 years. They connected me with a social services organization that helped people transitioning out of difficult situations. I was given temporary housing and help finding a job. I changed my name legally, started building a new identity from scratch. For the first few years, I looked over my shoulder constantly, jumped at every unexpected sound. But gradually, life began to feel normal again. I made friends who knew nothing about my past. I got an apartment and a steady job. I even started dating. The nightmares faded from every night to once a week, then once a month. I began to believe that I had truly escaped, that I was free. Then, exactly 7 years after I left, I heard my name whispered outside my window. Not the name on my driver's license, but the name I had been given in the congregation. The name I had tried so hard to forget. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was just a nightmare bleeding into waking life. But the next night, I heard it again. Clearer this time. Someone was standing outside in the darkness, saying my old name over and over, like a prayer or a curse. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, whoever had been there was gone. They found footprints in the soft earth beneath my window, someone who had stood there for a considerable amount of time. The whispers continued every night, for a week before stopping as suddenly as they began. I spent that week barely sleeping, sitting up with every light in my apartment turned on, a baseball bat clutched in my hands. I filed police reports, but there was little they could do without catching someone in the act. I installed security cameras and motion sensor lights. I even considered moving to a different city, starting over again with yet another new identity. But part of me rebelled against running again, against letting him take away the life I had built with such difficulty. During those sleepless nights, I started researching the congregation online with a determination I had never felt before. I knew from experience the direct searches yielded nothing, so I approached it obliquely, looking for patterns in missing persons reports, property records in rural Oregon, any trace of Father Matthias, or the senior members whose faces I still remembered. What I discovered was far more disturbing than I had imagined. There were others like me scattered across the country who had escaped and tried to build new lives. Some had blogs or forum posts where they shared their experiences, always anonymously. One post, buried in an obscure corner of the internet, stopped me cold. It was from someone who called themselves Phoenix, and they described an experience almost identical to mine. They had escaped the congregation 6 years ago, had built a new life, and then on the anniversary of their escape, the whispers had started. But for Phoenix, it hadn't stopped at whispers. They described finding items from the congregation left on their doorstep, photographs of themselves taken recently that showed they had been under surveillance. The post ended abruptly with no follow-ups. Phoenix simply stopped posting after that final entry. I found 3 other accounts similar to Phoenix's story, all describing the same pattern of harassment beginning on the anniversary of their escape, escalating over time, and then ending with no resolution. None of those people ever posted again. I tried to contact them through the platforms they had used, but my messages went unanswered. It was as if they had vanished completely, erased from the digital landscape as thoroughly as Rebecca Townsend had been erased from the congregation's active records all those years ago. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This was systematic. The congregation didn't just let people go. They tracked former members, waited for them to feel safe, and then initiated a campaign of psychological warfare designed to break them down. The whispers were just the beginning, a way of announcing that they knew where I was. But what was their endgame? Did they want me to come back? Or was this about something else entirely, some twisted form of punishment for daring to leave? I started varying my routine, never taking the same route home from work twice, avoiding patterns that could be predicted and monitored. I told my closest friends that I was dealing with a stalker situation, though I couldn't bring myself to explain the full truth. How could I make them understand without sounding completely insane? Even as I lived through it, part of me struggled to believe that an obscure cult from my past could have the resources to track down former members years after they left. 2 weeks after the whispers stopped, I found the first photograph slipped under my apartment door while I was at work. Inside the envelope was a picture of me sitting in the coffee shop I frequented, taken from across the street through the window. I was laughing at something on my phone, completely unaware of being watched. On the back, written in that familiar, precise handwriting, was a single sentence that made my blood run cold, despite its casual tone. More photographs followed over the next few days, showing me at the grocery store, getting into my car, walking through the park near my apartment. Each one was accompanied by a brief message in Father Matthias's handwriting, maintaining that tone of false warmth I remembered so well from my time in the congregation. The messages became increasingly insistent, the friendly tone acquiring an edge of impatience that made my hands shake whenever I found a new envelope waiting for me. I took everything to the police, but their response was frustratingly limited. Yes, this was harassment, possibly stalking, but without knowing who was leaving the materials or being able to connect them to a specific threat. There wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in my neighborhood. They suggested I consider a restraining order. But against whom? A man who might not even be his real name, leading an organization that technically didn't exist on paper. The detective assigned to my case was sympathetic, but clearly out of his depth. I decided to take matters into my own hands. If the congregation wanted to send me messages, maybe it was time I sent one back. I used my own research to find others who had escaped, reaching out through anonymous channels and encrypted messages. To my surprise, several people responded. We formed a small network, sharing information and experiences. What we pieced together was chilling. The congregation had grown significantly since I left, acquiring additional properties and developing sophisticated methods for tracking former members. One of my new contacts, someone who went by the handle Cypher, had managed to infiltrate the congregation's digital infrastructure before escaping. They had stolen files, terabytes of data that they kept heavily encrypted and backed up in multiple secure locations. Cypher explained that the congregation maintained detailed records on everyone who had ever been part of the community, with special attention paid to those who left. They had surveillance networks, hired private investigators, and even members whose sole purpose was to integrate into normal society and watch former members. The most disturbing revelation came from examining the patterns. Of the former members we could identify, approximately 60% had eventually returned to the congregation. Many went back during the harassment phase, broken down by the constant surveillance and psychological pressure, but others had disappeared entirely, vanishing without a trace after the harassment stopped. Cypher believed these people had been forcibly retrieved, brought back to the compound against their will. Once there, Father Matthias had ways of ensuring they never tried to leave again. The information Cypher shared gave me an idea. If the congregation was going to play psychological games, maybe I could play too. Instead of running or hiding, I decided to make myself visible in a very specific way. I started a blog, anonymous but detailed, describing my experiences in the congregation. I didn't use real names or specific locations, but I laid out the pattern of manipulation and abuse, the financial exploitation, the surveillance of former members. I wrote about Rebecca Townsend and the others who had disappeared. The response was overwhelming. Within days, hundreds of people had read my posts. Some reached out with their own stories, experiences in similar organizations or encounters with the congregation itself. A few journalists contacted me, interested in investigating further. For the first time since I had escaped, I felt like I wasn't alone, like there might actually be a way to fight back against an organization that had seemed untouchable for so long. But the congregation noticed too. The harassment intensified dramatically. The photographs became more invasive, showing the inside of my apartment from angles that suggested someone had been inside while I was away. I would come home to find small items moved or rearranged, subtle changes that made me question my own memory. The psychological toll was immense. I felt constantly off balance, unable to trust my own perceptions of what was real and what might be manipulation. Then the calls started. My phone would ring at random hours, and when I answered, There would be silence for a few seconds before Father Matthias's voice would come through, calm and measured as always. He never threatened me directly. Instead, he would ask how I was doing, if I was happy, if I had found the peace I was seeking when I left. He would tell me that the community missed me, that there was always a place for me to return to whenever I was ready. I started recording the calls, documenting everything. But Father Matthias was too clever to say anything explicitly incriminating. His words could be interpreted as the concern of a spiritual leader for a wayward follower. Nothing more. When I blocked his number, calls started coming from different numbers. Dozens of Tim, a never-ending stream that made my phone essentially useless. I had to change my number multiple times, but somehow they always got the new one within days of the change. The breaking point came when they went after my job. Someone sent an anonymous email to my employer, claiming I had a history of mental instability and was dangerous to work with. The email included carefully selected excerpts from my blog, framed to make me sound paranoid and delusional. I was called into a meeting with HR and my supervisor, where I had to explain a situation that I knew sounded absolutely insane. To their credit, they were patient and understanding, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I realized then that this was the strategy. The congregation wasn't going to grab me off the street or threaten me directly. They were going to systematically dismantle my life, destroy my credibility, isolate me from everyone and everything until I had nothing left and nowhere to turn except back to them. It was brilliant and horrifying in its calculated cruelty. And it was working. I could feel myself fracturing under the pressure, starting to doubt my own sanity. That's when Cypher reached out with a plan. They had been working with a few others from our network, people with various skills and resources, and they thought they had found a way to strike back. The congregation's power came from operating in the shadows, from the fact that most people didn't know they existed. But what if we changed that? What if we exposed them completely, brought everything into the light where it couldn't be ignored anymore? The plan was risky and probably illegal in several ways, but I was desperate enough to listen. Cypher had maintained backdoor access to the congregation's servers, and they believed they could extract all of their records. Financial transactions, surveillance logs, everything. We could release it all publicly, send it to law enforcement agencies, media outlets, anyone who would listen. The congregation would be forced to respond openly for the first time, and in doing so, they would lose the anonymity that made them so dangerous. We spent weeks preparing, coordinating with the other members of our network, making sure we had backup plans and safe places to go when the congregation inevitably retaliated. Cypher worked on the technical aspects while the rest of us gathered additional evidence, reaching out to former members who might be willing to speak on the record, documenting every instance of harassment and intimidation. We built a comprehensive case that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away with their usual manipulation tactics. The night we executed the plan felt surreal. I sat in a hotel room, 3 states away from my apartment, watching on my laptop as Cypher released years of the congregation's secrets to the world. Documents flooded onto journalism platforms, were sent directly to federal investigators, appeared on social media with hashtags that quickly started trending. The scale of the operation became apparent in those files. We had hoped to create a ripple. We created a tsunami that would finally wash away their power. The response was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets picked up the story within hours. Federal agencies announced investigations. Former members who had been too afraid to speak out before started coming forward with their own testimonies. The compound in Oregon was raided by law enforcement, and Father Matthias was taken into custody, along with several senior members. They found evidence of financial crimes. False imprisonment even remains buried on the property that suggested something far darker than simple manipulation. For me personally, the harassment stopped immediately. The calls, the photographs, the feeling of being constantly watched, all of it vanished overnight. I returned to my apartment to find it untouched for the first time in months. My phone stayed silent, except for legitimate calls. The relief was so profound it almost brought me to my knees. I had spent so long living in fear that the absence of it felt strange, like a weight I had carried for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. But the victory was bittersweet. As the investigation unfolded, the true scope of what the congregation had done became clear. Dozens of people who had tried to escape had been forcibly retrieved and held against their will. Some had been there for years, subjected to isolation and psychological torture designed to break their will completely. Several former members we had been trying to locate were found dead. Their deaths staged to look like suicides or accidents. The remains found on the property included Rebecca Townsend. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. I was asked to testify, to share my experiences publicly in ways that felt exposing and painful. Father Matthias maintained his composure throughout, presenting himself as a misunderstood spiritual leader, persecuted by a society that couldn't comprehend his message. But the evidence was overwhelming, and eventually, he and several others were convicted on multiple charges. The sentences ranged from decades to life in prison, ensuring they would never hurt anyone again. Even with the congregation dismantled and its leaders imprisoned, the effects linger. I still have nightmares sometimes. Still find myself checking over my shoulder, even though I know there's no one there. The other survivors I've stayed in touch with report similar experiences. Trauma like that doesn't just disappear because the source of it has been removed. We carry it with us, work through it in therapy, learn to live with the scars that may never fully fade. I've become an advocate for survivors of high-control groups and cult abuse, using my experience to help others recognize the warning signs and find their way out. The blog I started in desperation has become a resource for people seeking information and support. I've connected with hundreds of survivors from various organizations, each with their own story of manipulation and escape and recovery. The community we've built has become a kind of healing in itself. But sometimes, in the quiet moments late at night, I still hear my name whispered in the darkness. Not from outside my window now, but from inside my own mind. An echo of those years that will probably never fully fade. The voice of Father Matthias telling me I was chosen, that I was special, that I belonged. The voice of the person I was then, young and lost and desperate to believe in something. The voice of all the others who weren't as lucky as I was. I've learned to acknowledge these whispers without letting them control me. They're part of my history. A reminder of where I've been and how far I've come. I escaped a hidden cult once, and yes, sometimes they still whisper my name at night. But now, instead of filling me with terror, those whispers remind me of my strength, of the fact that I survived something designed to destroy me. I took that power back and used it to help others do the same. The Congregation of the Eternal Witness no longer exists as it once did. The compound has been sold, the properties dispersed, the financial networks untangled and redistributed to help the survivors rebuild their lives. Father Matthias will spend the rest of his life in prison, his charisma and manipulation finally rendered powerless. But the ideology, the tactics, the fundamental structure of how such organizations operate continues to exist in other forms, targeting other vulnerable people. That's why I continue to speak out, to share my story, even when it's painful. Even when people look at me with that mixture of pity and incomprehension that comes from hearing about experiences they can't quite fathom. Because for every person who escapes, there are others still trapped, still believing the lies, still thinking that the abuse is somehow love and that the prison is actually freedom. If my story can reach even one person and help them see the truth, then the whispers will have served a purpose. I am not the person I was when I entered the congregation at 19, broken and searching. I am not even the person I was at 26, when I ran through the forest with my name being called behind me. I am someone who survived, who fought back, who refused to let them win, even when victory seemed impossible. The whispers may never completely stop, but they no longer define me. I define myself now, and that freedom is something no cult can ever take away again.